Hello and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, February 16th. Now, there are various events that are happening, and there are some events that are not happening, which are said to be happening. And we're going to be discussing all of that tonight. As people know, there is a rally that is happening this coming Sunday, which was called Rage Against the War Machine. It actually began as a simple idea by some organizers to say something about the demands that they had for disbanding NATO, slashing the Pentagon budget, abolishing the CIA and the military-industrial deep state. And I'll just say these ideas were expected by them to have maybe, 1,500 people, 1,000 people, more or less the normal thing that might occur. Over time, and for various reasons, this has changed. No one actually knows exactly what's going to happen, but this situation has been transformed. And so you have a combination of publications that are attacking the rally. There's something called the Daily Kos, which attacked it. There is the Center for Countering Disinformation, the people that issued the kill list, the CCD in Ukraine, have attacked the February 19th event. Consortium News here in the United States has defended the event. Antiwar.com runs a piece also defending the event. And there are other media outlets that are saying something or other about it. Now, at the same time, there has been this significant bomb that has been thrown by the veteran journalist Seymour Hersh. And it's significant enough that what has happened is that if you look at the United States, where the bomb was intended to be exploded, what has happened is that all of the media of the United States have, which are the corporate media at least, have covered it in the following way. There's been a 166-word report in Bloomberg. There's been a 600-word roundup in the New York Post. There's been a 5-minute segment on Tucker Carlson, and there's been an attack on the article in Business Insider, saying that Hersh is a, quote, discredited journalist, and he has given a, quote, gift to Putin. That's the entire coverage in the entirety of the most media-saturated nation and population in the history of the world. However, the piece has caught the attention of other people. For example, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, at a press conference in Moscow, talked about this and said, as he put it, the management of the Western media has reached Orwellian proportions. That, quote, Seymour Hersh lists specific facts and dates when the White House and other divisions of the U.S. administration reviewed this matter. His written revelations coincide with the actual events recorded at pipelines. The UN is saying that it does not have the authority to investigate. All countries through whose economic zones Nord Stream pipelines pass have been completely silent for the past 6 months. He said that we've talked to Sweden and Denmark about this. They don't seem to have any information. And then talked about the fact that this was an attack on Germany. And he says that Seymour Hersh named the reason. The main thing was to prevent Germany from feeling in a comfortable energy zone and to start receiving gas through those two pipelines financed by companies from Russia, Germany, Austria, and Italy. So now that is important because it's not merely that Russia has brought it up, but others, like, for example, the nation of China and other nations are all looking at this. In addition, there has been coverage, and it's happened in things like Democracy Now! Or in the Jimmy Dore Show or any of the other locations that people on the call would probably generally be familiar with. But it's what Seymour Hersh said he's doing about it that I want to draw your attention to. He said yesterday, 7 o'clock in the morning, he wrote, I'm an old hand at dropping bombshell stories that are based on the disclosures of sources I do not and cannot name. There is a pattern to the response by the mainstream media. It dates back to my breakthrough story, the 1969 My Lai massacre revelation. That story was published in 5 installments over 5 weeks in 1969 by the underground media group Dispatch News. I had tried to get the 2 most important magazines in America, Life magazine and Look magazine, to publish the story with no success. Editors at both publications had earlier invited me to do some freelance writing for them, but they wanted nothing to do with the story about a massacre committed by American soldiers. And he talks about what happened, and as you know, that story won him the Pulitzer Prize and became the beginning of the unraveling of American faith in Vietnam. There was, of course, the earlier anti-war movement that Martin Luther King and others famously joined in 1967. But the actual unraveling in the United States of faith in the Vietnam War essentially began with the article by Seymour Hersh. And there's a lot of other things that he's done besides that. We're not going to talk more about that. His point, though, is, and it's important to understand, that the people who are the normal, that the government itself and the media, including the people that he had assumed would respond, were terrified and either lied that the story was untrue or remained silent. What's important here is that the attack on Nord Stream is an act of war. It was an act of war carried out by some force against against Russia and Germany, because those are the two countries that built the pipeline, paid for and built the pipeline. So besides the environmental damage, which of course was done and is rather important, the issue is, how was this actually directed? And Hersh has ideas about this. But what is important about me starting with this, say, well, this isn't really what we're doing. It's precisely what we're doing in the following way. Helga LaRouche in the last week has held Zoom meetings, sort of conferences with groupings in the United States, in the nation of India, youth, and persons also in other countries. These have all been happening like in the last 5 days. And what we are doing is we are constructing, or beginning at least to discuss, with many people with whom at least we have had political disagreements for a very long time, how this process of the slide into certain thermonuclear destruction can be reversed. Let me repeat that, because that's what we are going in the direction of, not probable, certain thermonuclear destruction. And one of the reasons it's certain is because people like Victoria Nuland or Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken are foolish people. These are people who are not smart enough to understand what forces they are unleashing. They don't have an appreciation for the nature of what we would call the arc of history. They don't believe, for various reasons, in much other than themselves and the ostensible power of the United States. But this is not the power that it exists in the world as a whole. Now, it's not a matter of getting mystical about this. It's a matter of understanding that there is something called natural law, if you will, which has nothing to do with whether it's acknowledged to be in existence or not. That kind of a force comes into being, comes into expression, one way or the other. Now, I will immediately hasten to add, and I think Bill Jones will probably cover this in some detail, we aren't talking about the aliens in the balloons. You know, if the aliens only have the balloons, those are pretty sorry aliens. And we'll talk about the balloon hoax in a little bit of time. But what we are seeing is a kind of collapse, an implosion into itself of the decadence adopted by the triumphalists of the United States in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 9th of 1989, and the adoption during May of 1990 of the doctrine of the unipolar world. It's something that occurred, which involved people like Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell in a different capacity, but he certainly went along with it, and Louis Libby and others, leading into the pursuit of the Iraq War, the first war of 91, but it was expressed in the attack on Panama and many other things that occurred at that point. You had this march of triumphalism, and it was a form of decadence that has now imploded the United States' power. The final stages, penultimate stages of the collapse of decadence are always imbecility. And what you see and what you're hearing in the imbecilic laugh or cackle of a Kamala Harris, or the behavior of a Victoria Nuland, or the discussion about the he, she, male, female, I don't know who I am, you don't know who I am. Then when you get to that level, all that has happened is that the imbecility that people have generally associated with incestuous royal families has descended upon the society as a whole. It begins to eat itself. And so you get recurring instances of mothers killing their children. And then you get even other kinds of bizarre things, which we see all over the society. You see, and Shakespeare writes about that sort of thing in plays like Julius Caesar, and the sudden descent of fire, the night before the assassination, and beings that seem to be walking from the dead, and those sorts of things. And the point of his introducing these things is the phrase "judgment thou hast fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason." Judgment thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. So for those of you who think that Shakespeare thinks Brutus is a hero, or that anybody in Julius Caesar is a hero, you might want to look at that play again. The American conceit that somehow there are good guys and bad guys doesn't change the truth of history. And so you are embarked upon a kind of descent, which has already occurred. It's not going to occur. You are living in the descent. And so now what has to happen is that those who have chosen the other path, which we have and so on, think this is a pretty good week. Matter of fact, there's a lot to be rather happy about what's happening this week, because these games have been suddenly exposed. And the real issue for people is that truth is an unstoppable natural force. Truth is not a set of deficits or opinions that may ultimately be listened to by the majority of people, and therefore may achieve traction in a difficult situation. No. Truth is a physical principle in the real universe. And that's just something that I'm asserting it now. I'm not proving it now. But that was always the conceptions of physical economy that Lyndon LaRouche was referring to. And so I wanted to start with that tonight, just to lay that out. The demonstration on Sunday has been sort of seized by other forces, good and bad. We don't really know quite what the outcome is going to be. We are going to be there, and we're going to be represented there by Diane Sayre in particular, and others that may or be able to play a role. So with that said, we thought we would take tonight and have a little bit more of a celebratory sense of things by not merely celebratory, but by sort of giving you a picture of reality versus the peculiar forms of psychological warfare and terror that are being spread out there by various forces. So the first person we're going to hear from is Bill Jones. Most people know him, but just to say, Bill, who has been in the organization for about the past 50 years, involved first in our organization in Europe, but has been working on the Asia desk, because it's very familiar with particularly the nation of China, and writes for Executive Intelligence Review and so on. In that capacity, he'll begin, and then we'll hear from Professor Cliff Kiracofe. Some of you have heard from him recently, and I'll introduce him a little bit more when we get to that point. So, Bill?
Yes, hi. Thanks, Dennis. I think I will second what Dennis said. I think it's a very good week. I think we have a turning point here. We have a, an emperor's new clothes moment, that the emperor, the United States, in all its arraignment, has now been exposed as naked force, even against friends. And Germany is a big ally. They're the ones that are suffering from the activities of the United States. So this is really, I think, a big moment, and it will be developing within the next few days and next few weeks. And I think it will also have an effect in terms of the demonstration on Sunday, because this is now creating a much different atmosphere. And this was the reporting of Seymour Hersh, which a lot of you people may not know, but it has revived the sense of something that probably those who are over 60 or over 50 don't recall, this idea of independent reporting. You get your daily newspaper, even the local newspapers. You're probably getting the story that's being put out by the administration through the New York Times and through the Washington Post, which is then filtering these stories to all your local journals in St. Louis and Seattle and elsewhere. This was not always the case. There has been a long period of independent journalism going back to the American Revolution. Tom Paine, with his common sense and with his flyers, was an example of this. You had during the Civil War, a lot of it, the famous paper by Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist paper called the St. Louis Observer, which was actually put out in Alton, Illinois, because there were a lot of Confederates in St. Louis. You had a strong German population that was pro-Union, but in the rest of the state there was a lot of Southern opinion, and Lovejoy had to move to Alton. Ultimately, it was also attacked by the slavery crowd and was killed. His death, like that of John Brown, was also a signal to the country that they should prepare for combat, because this was the only way that the issue of slavery would be resolved. And even John Quincy Adams noted the death of Lovejoy. He was also this independent journalist. Now, Hersh came out of an interesting situation, because he started at the Pentagon as a Pentagon reporter, and apparently he ran into some flack there, because he was right from the get-go very critical of much of what the military-industrial complex, which was existent at that time, but probably not as all-present as it is today. And he had a little problems there, so he ended up leaving. the Pentagon. But he was befriended by another journalist, an older gentleman by the name of I.F. Stone, who put out something called the I.F. Stone Weekly. And during the course of the McCarthy era, I.F. Stone was conducting independent journalism about what was going on in the world, including in the communist world, which was now being painted as the monster threatening the United States. He tried to maintain an independent view of this. A.Z. Stone also wrote one of his books was The Trial of Socrates. It gives you an idea of what he was all about. And I think probably in many respects he felt that he was like Socrates, that Socrates, of course, was sent to trial and the masses, were whipped up to attack him for a variety of reasons and finally executed as a result. And that, of course, Izzy Stone in those days probably felt the same way in terms of the McCarthy era. He was never, attacked or as far as I know, jailed, but he was always under pressure from the powers that be. And he kind of befriended Seymour Hersh when he saw an article. Izzy used to go out at 6 o'clock in the morning and buy about 20 different papers and wanted to see what was going on in the world. And he saw an article by Hersh and became very interested and gave him a call. And they struck up a very strong friendship. And so that it was out of that school that Hersh developed a lot of his own view of things, and has during the course of his career taken on all of the more difficult issues, the questions that could not be asked or people didn't dare to ask because they knew they would have a tough response, and began, of course, during the Vietnam Wars. As Dennis mentioned, the My Lai catastrophe, where 160 civilians in this Vietnamese village were killed, and you had Lieutenant Calley, who was the head of that company. He even at one point they had lined these people up. I mean, what was shown in this thing was a couple of things. And Calley, of course, was the one who was sent to jail because he himself was, really responsible for some of the most atrocious actions during the course of this. But what it showed for the general public as this was investigated was the fact that the Vietnam War was a matter of sending all these young, very, generally working class and farming community kids out into the jungles with no preparation. They had no understanding of the cultural situation. They knew they were in danger. They had their guns. They knew that the enemy was Oriental, and often enough they were simply told they could not distinguish. And it's true, they couldn't always distinguish, an enemy combatant from a innocent civilian. And this led to tragedies like the My Lai tragedy, where people were simply lined up along ditches and killed, like the Nazis used to do. And in one instance, and these guys, the company then, after killing these people, there was one woman there who had a baby, who had hidden the baby as she was, killed in this ditch. And the baby was still alive and then was crawling out of the ditch as these guys were, eating KP. And Calley said, "You shoot it." And the guy he gave the order to wouldn't do it. And so Calley grabbed the gun and he shot the baby. I mean, this horror story created a sense of the atrocity that the Vietnam War was, the lack of any preparation, lack of any motivation, lack of any understanding of what was going on in that country. And that as a result of that, the general public realized that, this has got to stop. And, of course, it led to all the demonstrations and the resignation, ultimately the resignation of Lyndon Johnson, or the decision that he would not run for president again. So these kind of things, this exposés, can have the kind of a wave-like, it's like dropping a wave in the ocean, and then it spreads out all over the ocean. This is the kind of situation which I believe we're in now. Hersh went on to do a lot of other things, and it's not necessary to go through them. Abu Ghraib, remember the torture chambers during the Iraq War? He was the first one on that. The killing of Salvador Allende, who was one of the first campaigns that the labor committees internationally was involved in, because this was Henry Kissinger's war against so-called leftists in Chile, and it was really what do you call it? Color revolution of the old time. They didn't call it in those days. He got rid of Allende and bring in a brutal dictator, Pinochet, who was there for I don't know how many years, almost decades. And so he exposed that operation. He also exposed the fact that the Israelis had developed a nuclear weapon, the Samson Project. Of course, well, everybody knows that now. It's not a big thing, but in those days they were denying it. We don't have a nuclear weapon because we're not allowed to do it because of the NPT treaties. But he exposed that, and also he exposed, more importantly, the COINTELPRO operations against the left, which led to the Church Committee. And we're talking about the Church Committee now, where the Republicans now want to set up a new Church Committee. He's the one that got that into motion by the expose of these FBI operations against the anti-war movement and also the civil rights movement. So he has a record, been attacked a lot, been called, always said that he didn't have enough evidence on this or that, but he's a very serious journalist, and he doesn't go out with a story unless he knows what he's talking about. And when he goes out with it, he may not tell you everything that he knows. And I think in this instance, he has already indicated that he has not told us everything that he knows, and that there's more to this story. So it's really like a bombshell. And of course, you have the State Department saying this is ridiculous, this is nonsense. They won't even discuss the issue because the thing is just so sensitive. But trying to discredit somebody with the track record of Seymour Hersh is a very dangerous game, because people know what he has done for the most part, and they also realize that this is serious business that he's talking about. And what he's saying, of course, is that the United States, which has created this alliance of democracies, the so-called alliance of democracies, the white hats in the world against the so-called autocracies, China and Russia, the United States has now committed a crime against one of the major economies in this alliance of democracies, which is going to cause a lot of devastation for the people in that country. This pipeline was really a lifeline, providing relatively cheap energy to German homes, and they're going to have a tough time this winter. It's not going to be an easy task in trying to get Norwegian oil or Arab oil or U.S. oil going over in LNG tankers. What's that going to cost them compared to what they have been paying on this? Nobody has made any indication of the actual cost of this. And the cost is not just in terms of money, in terms of how much people are paying. It's also cost in lives, because, if people can't make the payments, they can't keep up the heat, and the winter becomes very cold, then things become very dangerous for health. So it undercut. It is an attack both not only against Russia, which of course it was, but also attack against their big ally Germany. And as Hersh indicated, it was because they did not want any possibility of Germany at any point during this what could be a very cold winter deciding that they would withdraw from this war because it was becoming too costly for them. They no longer have that option out for them, and it was felt that will keep them in the war camp for the entire duration. This may not work so well, because the ripple effects of the story are also being filtered out in Germany. Again, not the same way. They're not taking up the story in the mainstream media either, but it is going out. Hersh himself said that he had gone to this the media, this internet media, for the simple reason that none of the other papers would take the story, and he found that he now has 1 million users after he put this thing out. So it is getting out, and it's getting out in the same way in Germany as well. And as he indicated himself, people are extremely angry with what happened because these questions have existed ever since the explosion occurred, and the suspicions have existed. But now the suspicions are being confirmed by an independent source, a source which cannot be called a Russian hack or a paid informer because of who he is. And so that creates a much different situation. What it has done, of course, is had a tremendous effect internationally in reviving an offensive, political offensive on the part of Russia and on the part of China. What Lavrov did today, or what the Russian Duma now has done, is appeal to the United Nations Security Council, calling for investigations of the source of this sabotage, and taking consideration to what Seymour Hersh has said. They want a full investigation at the level of the United Nations Security Council. Now, the UN Security Council has initially declined doing this, saying that they can only accept, I think the argument was they can only accept a call for investigation from a legitimate UN organization, not from an individual country. But Russia is arguing that that is not the case, that there is a precedent earlier set by the United States, which was claiming that Syria was responsible for chemical warfare against the opposition, and they wanted the United Nations to investigate this. And because of the pressure of the United States, they did begin to launch such an investigation. So that's the precedent they can use. Now, Russia will do that. There will be a meeting, as far as I understand, on this. That doesn't mean that the investigation begins. It means that the debate begins. But today, both Russia and also China has indicated they do want an investigation. And you will have very soon, you will have Wang Yi, the state counselor, former foreign minister, who has been really promoted as a foreign policy advisor, who will be going to Russia to discuss these issues. And it's also probably going to be a meeting between President Xi and President Putin sometime this year. And this obviously is going to be an important part of the element of the discussion. So it's really now in a new ball game now. This whole investigation has become a matter of an international mobilization to come to the bottom of what actually went on. And it's going to be really, I think, impossible to stop that, given the dynamic of the situation. And of course, what we will be doing, what Helge is doing, what will be done also, at least on our part, in terms of the demonstrations and the webcast going forward, is to also build the international support in all these various areas where we have contacts to make sure that this does occur, that not only China and Russia are asking for this, but also countries in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere are making the same demands to come get to the bottom of what this is all about. So the administration really has egg on its face, and of course they can deny, but the facts of the matter are there, and it's going to be very hard for them to try and sweep this thing under the rug at this point. What I think they have done is, because as this story was gelling, there was a desire to have something on the front pages that would preclude the story of the Hersh revelations. And I think they came up with this balloon issue. Now, obviously, the balloon was flying around there, and the Pentagon knew that, and their first reaction was, this is not a security problem for the United States. And then all of a sudden, you had a turnaround, and they said, oh, look, this is very serious. Blinken was supposed to go to China to, the follow-up of so-called good relations that were established between Xi and Biden in November, and that was suddenly called off. And then they shot this thing down with a Sidewinder missile to try and pick up the pieces. And it didn't stop there, because then they have all these other things that are occurring there where they're taking, the planes are going up. There are probably several of them, including AWACS, to try. How much money is being spent? These balloons. The last two things that they shot down probably cost, as much as $100 to fly, and these Sidewinder missiles cost $400,000. And this is what they're doing to shoot this down. And even Biden had to come out today and say they were probably just either weather balloons or something, kind of shamefacedly, to admit that these weren't Chinese balloons. So it's become, it's really turning into a major farce for the administration. And of course, nobody knows what this original balloon was. I assume it might be a meteorological balloon, But even if there were, intelligence things there, look, the Chinese. I'm looking at some here today. It's called the China Sky Eye, which is in Guizhou. You've probably seen pictures of this. It was built into a massive, valley, and designed in accordance with this. It's how much? 500 meters, in diameter, and it's a spherical radio telescope, and it's discovered more than 740 new pulsars as of Tuesday. And so why would the Chinese, send up a balloon, for intelligence purposes? I mean, they have the quality of satellites, which I'm sure are equal to what the United States has, and anything they want to learn about what's going on in the ground, they're not going to send up a balloon to deal with this. So this the aura of ridicule is just absolutely incredible. So that you have the administration has not had a very good week this week, and I think it's going to continue in this way. I do not want to underestimate the seriousness of the situation, because, you do have that they are on, you look at what Austin said, still insisting that we're going to continue this campaign until, we win this war. Biden is going to Poland, I think probably in the next couple of days. Poland is, Lavrov calls it the hyena of Europe. These guys are worse than the Ukrainians, are worse than anybody in terms of, because they have just a built-in hatred for everything Russian. And so that they're trying to turn the screws on this thing. They have built up their military significantly. It's said that they have one of the most impressive militaries in Europe at this point. And there are, thousands of these NATO troops, not only Poles, and NATO troops on the border of Belarus. So that Belarus has expressed, they have made a number of statements today warning about the situation, saying that they are not interested in going to war in Ukraine, and they're not going to do that. But if they are attacked at any point, they are prepared to defend themselves. And they have also, Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has also asked Putin to have these Russian soldiers who are now training in Belarus, thousands of Russian soldiers who are doing training, that some of them must remain there for security reasons, that they're extremely nervous about what's going on now, probably in the aftermath of this trip. Lukashenko also took that kind of jocularly, in one sense, he says, well, Putin is coming there tomorrow, which he is, for, I think it's a annual meeting of the Gazprom that he's going to attend. And he and Lukashenko said, well, if Biden's going to be imposed, he should come here. We can have a trilateral meeting. He says even Zelensky, if he wants to come, we can do that. We can talk about peace. Of course, they're not going to do that, but that's the attitude that they have. So it is serious. I mean, you can't ignore that fact. But I think we have won a significant victory. Thanks to largely to what Hersh has done in this and is going to do, and it's a ball that we can run with to make it into a much bigger effect than he alone could do that, and which we know how to do. In many respects, if this is successful, this will be probably his biggest breakthrough at this point, because even helping stop the Vietnam War was great, but in this case, it's helping stop nuclear war. So, and I think he's aware of it. Look, he's 86 years old. He's no spring chicken now. This is his, probably his swan song. So I think he's going to try and make the most out of it. I think we should try and make the most out of it in our own way as well as we can. So that's really what I wanted to say.
Okay, good, Bill. Thanks a lot. And what we're going to now do is go to Dr. Cliff Kiracofe. A lot of people know, former senior staff member of U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and he's the president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development. So, Cliff, you've now got the floor.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and it was great to hear Bill's presentation. I think I'd start by reminding us of our First Amendment to our Constitution, and it talks about freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And back in that day, the press meant a printing press, and the printing press printed newspapers and books. So when we're talking about the freedom of the press in the old-fashioned sense, it's newspapers and books. So what Cy has done, I met Cy many years ago in the 80s in Washington, D.C. He's a meticulous professional. He's not going to write an article that's not completely sourced sentence by sentence. And he quotes one source, but he never says that he didn't have other sources. I suspect he may do a follow-up article or possibly even a book. Who knows? But the only thing I can say about Cy is he's a meticulous professional and has deep contacts in Washington and Capitol Hill, White House, Pentagon, intelligence community, etc. And he's had that for over 40, 50 years. So I take his story to be accurate until disproven. And I think he brings in the United States and Norway as the two main actors. But the Russians also have brought out the point that the Poles and Danes and Swedes and could have been involved as well, or at least informed and know about the situation. So the freedom of the press, this is what Bill is referring to as independent investigators in journalism. And if we look around the world today, we see that freedom of thought, speech, and press is becoming, as Dennis said, more Orwellian. Orwell, 1984 book, a famous book, and about sort of a totalitarian society being constructed. And I think the global perspective is important for us, the Orwell perspective, and we see from that perspective, we can see how disinformation, misinformation, and lies, propaganda, are being spread throughout the world from different centers in NATO and the United States. And it is purposeful propaganda, and purposeful misinformation. And in NATO, in a military strategy, it's called cognitive warfare. That is to say, it's a war for our minds, cognitive warfare. And you can Google cognitive warfare and find articles about how the NATO people theorize on how they're going to brainwash and propagandize the planet through what they call information warfare. So that's what our context for what we're in the midst of with the Seymour Hersh piece. He's put out the truthful statement, and now the misinformation apparatus, the information war apparatus is at work. Some of us have actually been the targets of that apparatus emanating out of Ukraine, for example, or other NATO locations, or even the United States. So let's keep in mind then our First Amendment rights and freedom of speech and freedom of the press. With respect to the Ukraine situation, well, let's go to the pipeline, the actual pipeline itself first. U.S. and Norway blow up the pipeline. The pipeline is a strategic supplier of low-cost fuel, natural gas, to Germany. The consequences of this are going to be long-term, and it's going to impact negatively, and it already has impacted negatively, the European economy as a whole, and that will continue. It's pricing European products, manufactured goods, at a higher price because they have to pay more for the energy to make the product. It's putting bakeries, it's putting glass manufacturers, it's putting corporate businesses that use a lot of energy that needs to be at a good price for them to make a profit. If the energy is too expensive, they go out of business. Or some will move to another location like the United States or some other location where there's low-cost fuel. So this is going to have so it's not just a blow against Russia and Russian exports. It's a blow against the entire European economy, particularly the German, but the entire European economy is affected. This negative effect is going to take the form of social unrest. As the economy frays and disintegrates, you're going to have rising social unrest. And that's already been seen in demonstrations in Europe of hundreds of thousands of people in the streets in major cities, as well as maybe mid-sized cities and even smaller cities. People demonstrating against the economic situation, but also demonstrating against the war in Ukraine. So it's a combination of peace activism and also touching on domestic issues. We've also seen the repression of those peaceful demonstrations in the street with brutal police tactics, including the use of violent force against unarmed peaceful demonstrators, as well as tear gas and all the rest. So you have social unrest increasing in Europe. With respect to the Ukraine war, well, let's take it in several steps here. First the war, and then we can go to some history. The war itself, if we look at the map on the ground and see where the Russian troops are, Russia has successfully gained about 20% of the Ukraine territory, which is the Donbass region, which is the Russian-speaking area that was under fire from the Ukrainian Nazi government. The Russians intervened February 24th last year, and they intervened under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which permits countries to intervene for humanitarian purposes in emergency situations. So they based their intervention on the UN Charter, Article 51, and you can Google that and look that up. The Russians had proposed, as the crisis was building earlier, several months earlier, the Russians proposed on December 17th to the United States and a little later, a few days later, to NATO, hey, let's sit down and have a diplomatic discussion of this crisis and work out a peaceful solution and work out a new security architecture for Europe. So the Russians attempted diplomacy. The United States rejected that diplomacy out of hand, and NATO rejected the diplomacy out of hand. So therefore, the Russians felt that with the diplomatic avenue closed and the situation getting worse in February, that they would need to actually physically intervene with military force. Excuse me. So what we have now is what we call three axes of advance, one in the south near Zaporozhye area. You can look at that on the map. One in the Bakhmut area, which is ongoing now, about to be encircled. And then one further north in Kharkov, which would be in the east. And then, as was earlier mentioned, there's a concentration of forces, Russian and Belarusian forces in the northern border of Ukraine. The analytical question is, well, are the Russians going to just steadily advance as they're doing and go slow and just steadily and thoroughly advance until they get what they figure they need for strategic purposes, which is probably all the territory east of the Dnieper River? And you can look that up on a map, the eastern and southern Ukraine. The other analytical thought by military specialists is, well, they're doing pretty well wrapping things up with the go slow approach and thorough approach. Now they may undertake a more robust initiative on all three axes, if not a fourth coming down out of Belarusia. So those analysts expect some fairly dramatic military moves within the next 2 or 3 weeks while the ground is still frozen hard and tanks and heavy armor and equipment can move across the battlefields. So we should be keeping our eye on the situation over the next couple of weeks to see if the Russians indeed will dramatically scale up the operations or whether they'll just continue with their step-by-step operations. What is Ukraine? Ukraine, the word itself means borderland. Ukraine, a borderland, in the 17th century, for example, going back, say, 300 years, it was never a separate country. It was part of the Russian Empire of the Tsars. And it would be a tiny portion of the map of Ukraine today, somewhere in the center-south. So it's a small portion. Ukraine is like a Frankenstein monster over the centuries and decades, past century. Pieces of territory were added to Ukraine and under the Tsars. And once the Tsars fell, then there was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between the German army and the Bolsheviks or Lenin and the Soviets who had just taken over Russia. And the treaty provided that Ukraine would be independent and the Baltic states would be independent. The Germans wanted to neutralize Ukraine in a separate peace with Russia so that they could shift their forces westward toward France, etc., in World War I. So the Ukraine is a patched together country, and Lenin himself gave Ukraine the entire area that Russia is currently taking back to Russia. So that is why they are Russian-speaking people there, because it used to be part of the Tsars, part of the Russian Empire. And then after World War II, Stalin gave bits and pieces of Ukraine up in the northern area, northwestern area, to Ukraine. They took it away from Poland and other areas, Hungary and a few other slices. So what is currently Ukraine has been cobbled together, particularly since World War I, and therefore, it has many ethnic groups and also religions. The western portion is Roman Catholic, and the eastern and southern portion is predominantly Orthodox Russian. So there are religious as well as ethnic divisions in the country. The country was, contested in the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. When the Soviet Union ended in 1991, it gained its independence as an independent physical country. And in recent years, in 2014, there was a coup d'etat that the United States launched and replaced the elected government with you could say a revolutionary government or a fascist government that's composed of many neo-Nazi political groups and armed militia groups. So that's 2014. There were a couple of presidents in and out, Poroshenko, and now we have Mr. Zelensky. And he's backed by the neo-Nazi political organizations in Ukraine. He has suppressed 11 or so independent democratic political parties, and he has suppressed all the news media in Ukraine that is opposition news media. So it's essentially a fascist dictatorship that the United States and NATO is supporting. And the reason that we have supported them since 2014 is sort of a dagger pointed at Russia. The whole idea is to use Ukraine against Russia. And that idea was circulated importantly in Washington by a former national security advisor and professor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And he wrote a famous book about the global chessboard. And he recommended that the West, sort of detach Ukraine from Russia and sort of aim Ukraine at Russia. So it's a long-term strategy going back, 30 years or so. So it's and even more back into the Cold War era, where we supported neo-fascist, neo-Nazi secret movements inside of Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So the United States has supported, since World War II, the early 50s, neo-Nazi networks because it was argued that, well, these guys are neo-Nazi networks, that'd be great to use against the commies. So that's the strategy, use the Nazis against the commies. Basically, to conclude on Ukraine, Ukraine has lost the war. Russia has absorbed the Russian-speaking area, which is called Donbass, and that area is actually now part of Russia. The Russian Duma and the Russian, legislative processes and all of that have recognized that physical territory as now part of Russia. It's not part of Ukraine anymore from their point of view. It's legally part of Russia. So that part that they occupy right now is not ever going to go back to what's called Ukraine. It has been recovered by Russia, where Russia had it since Catherine the Great in the Tsarist era, or she's Tsarina. So in terms of the war in Ukraine, Ukraine has lost. NATO has lost. The United States has lost. And the extent of the loss, or the territorial part of the loss, will depend on the Russian military moves in the coming weeks. But the fact is, they've lost. Plus, U.S. and NATO have depleted massive amounts of their ammunition and war supplies and missiles and all sorts of stuff to a very serious extent, where it's going to take years at present production rates for the United States to fill up its missiles and all that sort of stuff, ammo and all that, and the same with Europe. So it's depleted, severely depleted military capabilities in Europe and in the United States. So Ukraine has lost. It's lost. It's a lost war. So we'll have to see how the denouement works out militarily first on the ground, what the Russians are going to do. And then after that, diplomacy is inevitable. There's always diplomacy after a war. That's just how it is. So depending on when the war ends, or if there's a truce or an armistice or a ceasefire or some other type of a legal diplomatic situation, then once that is established, there will be diplomacy, and then there will be a peace settlement at some point. It just depends on how much the Ukrainian people tragically die and get bled because of their dictator Zelensky and neo-Nazi groups. They're losing hundreds of thousands of young people and troops, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a fairly severe loss for the country of Ukraine. About 10 million Ukrainians have fled Ukraine. The population before the war was about 37 million people. About 10 million people have fled, maybe 8 or so into Europe, and a couple of million have fled into Russia. And then you have who knows how many internally displaced people now in Ukraine. So maybe the population has been whittled down to 20 million, 22 million, et cetera. Who knows? But there's a demographic problem too. Very tragic, very sad. So that's the Ukraine situation, quickly. And that's the situation with this expose of Seymour Hersch. And I think Bill is absolutely right, and Dennis, that this is the bombshell. It's exactly the political bombshell we needed to energize the anti-war movement. And it's been, of course, suppressed, as was mentioned, in the United States and in Europe, but in the major press. But it is getting out into some of the smaller independent media, and it could be a spark for a new anti-war movement. Those of us who lived back in the Vietnam days in the late 60s and 70s, early 70s, in the anti-war movement then, it was massive. I mean, there was a massive anti-war movement across the United States on all campuses and big cities and even small towns. There was a massive anti-war feeling in the United States back then. Unfortunately, that hadn't developed during the Iraq or Iran war, and everybody was pretty passive. But as Bill said, maybe this Seymour Hersh bombshell will get us going and spark things. And I sure hope that new idea of the rally or this coming weekend, the peace rally in Washington D.C., Rage Against the Machine, will be a success. And there's no doubt that Cy's article will help it. That's what I have to say for now.